Hey guys, I'm MikroTik Marc, and welcome to Bridge Mode, where we connect with real-world network operators and professionals to talk about network deployments and explore their questions and stories. Join us as we connect ideas, solutions, and the people who make it all happen. Today with me, I've got Tyler Casey. Tyler, would you introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about what we're going to talk about today?
Sure. I am Tyler Casey. I am the network engineer and one of the co-owners of DM Tech Internet. We are a rural WISP or wireless internet service provider located in Corning, California, which is a rural town in the northern region of California. And we use a lot of MikroTik gear in our WISP.
Awesome. Yeah, so Tyler and I have talked a whole bunch of times about a whole bunch of different things. And one of the things that he's kind of spearheaded in his own network was ensuring that you can do layer three hardware forwarding. Let me know a little bit about why you made that decision and how did you come to deciding that that was an important thing for DM Tech's network?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, layer three hardware offloading is I mean, it's not necessarily new in the MikroTik landscape, but it's new-ish, like it's new enough. And so I guess for anybody that doesn't know what layer three hardware offloading is, I guess maybe that should be the first thing that we should explain is why that matters, like why that is even important. So, with across the whole MikroTik product line, traditionally you would have routers and then you'd have, switches. And routers, of course, are going to have more capable CPUs that are kind of dedicated to that purpose, like to deeper routing functions. And some routers even do have a switch ASIC on them as well. So you have to check the spec sheet on the particular router that you're working with because some are CPU only, where all of the ports have their own lane back to the CPU. Some of them, the ports go to a switch, and then the switch has its own lane back to the CPU, and then some are a hybrid. So really, you would want to look at the like the diagram. It's on the product page where it shows, you'd want to look and see, and that's actually its own separate discussion about making sure that you're picking the right device, for the right application. But so traditionally, and this is true with MikroTik as well, your devices that were specifically targeted as being switches did have a CPU in them, but it's kind of a wimpy, puny CPU. Like it's a CPU that's only really for management functions. But because of the power of router OS, MikroTik being what it is, you can still configure a switch to do routing functions. Like a lot of their switches still support Winbox. Now, if it's a switch that doesn't support or I shouldn't say Winbox, we'll say Router OS. If it's a switch that supports Router OS, then you have the full power of Router OS that you can throw at it, but that doesn't mean that it can do it well. So they also have some switches that support uh, only switch OS, which most MikroTik users are aware of. Any switch that only supports switch OS does not support layer three hardware offloading. So you'd have to look and make sure if it's a switch OS only, you're not going to get any hardware offloading available. But if it is one that can dual boot or really just any switch that supports router OS, you can do routing functions on it. But prior to the launch and introduction of router OS version 7, because I guess that's a key thing, is layer three hardware offloading only existed in, semi-recent iterations of ROS v7. So it never existed at all on v6. So if you're wanting to leverage hardware offloading, you're going to have to upgrade to V7 no matter what. So you're going to have to rip off that Band-Aid. If you had reservations about going to V7, I would say it's stable now. I think they've got it pretty well hammered out that you can use it in a production network. Um,
I'd agree with you. And
yeah,
yeah, so I think maybe one of the things I'm gleaning from what you're talking about is that in a common scenario, you're probably going to have a high-powered router that's also expensive and a switch there to aggregate all the ports.
Yes, yeah. And
Part
that's the
of what
way.
I'm guessing you're looking for, is combining those into one unit, so you've got, less points of failure, less
Yes,
complexity in the physical design. Yeah, keep
absolutely.
going.
Yeah.
Tell me more about it.
Yeah, I can share. So with the understanding that most switches, especially version 6 switches, even though they do have a CPU, and admittedly, I'll be the first to say it, before L3HW was stable, if it was a small enough tower, like a small little one-off site, we would just use switches and we would just configure them as routers and just roll with it. And honestly, it was
Yeah.
fine.
Where did that work? Where did that work well as far as like capacity, bandwidth, size, throughput?
Right.
And
So
where did
if
that
you
not work
actually look,
well?
even with non L3HW, if you go to a spec sheet on one of the MikroTik switches, they will tell you the expected routing performance, and we're talking not L3HW, we're just talking all CPU driven routing. And I want to say a lot of their, like semi-nice, like mid-range switches can still route, probably several hundred megabits per second or even, a gig or more. I mean, I can pull up one. And so I was like, you know what? If I've got a site, and this site does 150 megs at peak, 200 megs at peak. I mean, shoot, yeah, like you can do all of that in the CPU and no problem. And you don't even have to, we wouldn't have to have like a router on a stick config where you've got a router paired with like a higher power PoE switch. You could just do it all on one. But of course, that you will hit that limit on that CPU pretty quick and you'll want to pivot to something else. So what we would do is, wherever possible, we would have only a router, that was doing the functions of router plus switch. And then once the site outgrew that or got to the point that the bandwidth or just the packets per second was more than what was sustainable, then typically we would swap out for a more capable router trunked to a PoE switch, and for years and years and years, because again, we're a WISP, uh, the kind of the PoE switch of choice for us was the Netonic series. And there's plenty of PoE switches out there, and that's for a totally different discussion. How the WISP community feels about Netonics is a totally different discussion. And I'll let you do your own research on that. But the reality is that it was a very capable switch that supported it had a high port density. It supported a huge range of DC input voltage options. It provided, 2 and 4 pair PoE on every port that it had. So, it's obviously for a WISP, it was kind of the dream, it's kind of the dream switch. Right. So, for the last 10 years, we've the way that we've really only had two different deployment models. We've had and again, this is, you got to understand that it's WISP and MikroTik, although like MikroTik doesn't exclusively make stuff for WISPs. Like MikroTik makes stuff for, in they're a vendor. So it's however, whatever your industry vertical is, if you can make use of MikroTik, then great. But it's not like they're a product that is really focused toward WISPs. So obviously for us, the things that are most critical for WISPs is it has to be something that's like outdoor rated, right? It has to be something that's waterproof. It has to be something that's UV resistant. It has to be something that can be deployed in the elements. Or if you're not getting something that's deployable in the elements, you have to be putting it in a shelter or an enclosure or like a NEMA box or
Mm.
something like that. So that kind of informs a lot of your purchase decisions when we're shopping for MikroTik gear. Is we're like, okay, well, what environment can we use this in, and what's the application that we would really want to use this? So perfect example, which I say was kind of like for WISPs using MikroTik, at least us. I guess I'm relatively new. I'm not like a WISP godfather, that's been in the industry a long time. I've been in it about 15 years, but there's guys who've been in it a lot longer than me. And so for me, one of the most significant contributions in recent memory is the MikroTik PowerBox Pro. So the PowerBox Pro is classified as a router. It's not classified as a switch. And it's just a regular 5-port, PoE router, but that you can power it itself with PoE, and then you can also do PoE out. And it's a capable router. It's all weather. And so for a really small micro pop, if you're deploying like a small micro pop that you're planning on having a small number of customers and not a lot of bandwidth, it's a really ideal router. Yeah, because you can just clamp it onto the leg of the tower. You can just about put it anywhere. It's waterproof, and you can just start sending bits. And honestly, we have them out there today. So, but what happened in the past is once we outgrew a PowerBox Pro, either by bandwidth or more commonly than outgrowing it by bandwidth, we would just outgrow the port density of it. And so we would need to add more APs. We'd need to add more backhauls. So at the time that the PowerBox Pro was released, there really weren't any switches made by MikroTik that were all weather. All of the switches had to be like in an enclosure of some kind. So really that forced your hand. At that point, now you have to get an enclosure and you have to do a router on a stick type configuration where you have a higher power router that's trunked to a more capable PoE switch like an Atonix or something like that. So that's how we did it forever. So in more recent years, one of the more significant game changers that I saw come from MikroTik was the NetPower 16. The NetPower 16P. When that launched, it launched with only RouterOS version 6. At the time that that switch was produced, V7 didn't exist even in beta. It wasn't there. So at least I think maybe if somebody if that's wrong, then please somebody correct me. But I seem
Sure.
to
But
remember
basically, no L3 hardware.
right. It was launched as just a switch. And what was interesting is because effectively, at least when I saw it, I thought, well, the net power just kind of looks like a larger kind of looks like the big brother of the PowerBox Pro. They're both outdoor rated. They both support PoE out. They both support DC in. I'm like, it just seems like the PowerBox Pro, but bigger. Um, but then, on the MikroTik website, the PowerBox Pro was still being classified as a router, and the NetPower 16 was classified as a switch. Now, if you pull up the spec sheets of the two side by side, it is still pretty apparent that the NetPower, even if you're using both of them as a router, is still a more capable router than the PowerBox Pro is. Even L3HW set aside. So for me, I was like, okay, well, even if they're calling it a switch, it's still more powerful than the PowerBox Pro. And so we kind of really started trying to deploy more of those because then we got to go away from the router on a stick where you have a higher power router with a higher number of ports. And we got to say, hey, let's go back to kind of like a PowerBox Pro version 2 where we can still have a high density of PoE and not have to do a router on a stick configuration, and we don't have to have an enclosure and so on and so forth. So
And that was
even before,
probably good to a couple hundred megs, but
oh
obviously it's
yeah,
going to start
yeah,
to
right.
fail at high capacity.
Right. And MikroTik's pretty transparent about that. If you look at the spec sheet, you can pull it up and you can kind of see what's expected of that. But the net power again was another game changer. That's another one. If you're a WISP where you need PoE and you need it outdoor, that's like, that it's ideal. That's the most ideal product that you can get. So around, and I'd have to look through the change log because I don't exactly remember when layer 3 hardware offloading was announced
I
or
think it
when
was
when
right
it was.
away. I think it was like 7.1.
Okay. So admittedly
And
we
then
were
different devices, I think, came in,
right. Admittedly, we were pretty late to the game deploying L3 HW, but that's kind of on purpose. I think that any operators, operators kind of know you don't necessarily want to be one of the first to onboard with features like that. I once heard it put, every network engineer has a test environment. Some are just fortunate to have a separate production environment.
That is that is the most accurate way to put it.
Right. So but initially, when I was reading about it, I kind of didn't understand. I was trying to wrap my head around what MikroTik was saying, like that it could do. But then, as version 7 became more stable, because version 7, and again, I guess I should make it clear. Um, every router across the entire, or every device, forget router, every single device across the entire MikroTik product line, and we're talking down to like the HAP minis, all the way up to their 60 gig stuff and the routers and their switches. Almost everything that supports router OS can be upgraded to version 7. Almost everything, with very little exception.
Mhm.
But just because you can upgrade a device to the version 7 does not mean that that device supports layer 3 hardware offloading. So
There's
just
very few that do.
right, there is a few, and fortunately on the wiki, MikroTik has like their help pages, their wiki, and they actually specifically list which devices even support L3HW at all. But then within L3HW, it actually breaks down even further because certain features of L3HW are only supported on certain switches or routers. So you really have to look to make sure that that the feature that you're looking for is supported by the hardware that you have. But if you're trying to upgrade to version 7 to take advantage of L3HW and your router, whatever you have, doesn't even support it, then I mean, you can still upgrade to version 7 if there's a feature that you really want. But at that point, it's up to you to decide, is it worth going to V7 or just stick with V6. So um, I guess so. Then the next question is, okay, well, what exactly does layer 3 hardware offloading do? And I'm going to assume that most people watching this hopefully understand what it does and why it is that you'd want to do it. So with well, all switches in the MikroTik product line do have a CPU in them in some capacity, but like I said, most of the time the CPU is pretty limited. It's a little bit puny. But they started the switches have the MikroTik switches that are true switches have a switch ASIC, and I think that it's only possible because of the partnership between MikroTik and I think it's the Marvel switch ASICs is what are allowing this magic to kind of happen. So essentially, what is happening is in layer 3 hardware offloading, the switch ASIC that is in your switch is able to do IP routing. It's able to do layer 3 routing, but that is a significant difference than having the CPU on a switch doing routing, because we already established, even a flimsy CPU in a MikroTik switch, because it's running router OS, it can do what router OS can do, but very limited. But when you have a dedicated switch ASIC, you guys understand that a switch ASIC can pass a huge number of packets. It's very, 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 very fast. It's line speed. It's wire speed. So layer 3 hardware offloading effectively allows you to have layer 3 functions, and again, check the wiki to see which functions you're looking for, but allows the switch to handle layer 3 functions at wire speed. And once I've read that and I understood it,
And so
uh,
let's back up for a second and talk
yeah,
about what that might look like for real world use case, right? Because I'm guessing back in your power box days, you talked about this a little bit, right? And it's not just a power box, right? It's any of the old switches probably behaved fine as long as you were only looking to pass 100 meg, maybe
yeah,
pushing 200 meg. And now you're starting to drop lots of traffic because those CPUs are getting overwhelmed, right?
yes,
And what we're
yep,
saying is, yeah, they've added more CPU and RAM, and maybe you'll get a couple hundred meg more out of that, but you're definitely not getting gig line speed, wire rate out of these boxes
right.
until layer 3 hardware comes.
Yes, yeah. So, and the PowerBox Pro, because it's not a switch, and I don't know if the PowerBox Pro even has a switch ASIC in it at all. I'd have to I'd have to pull it up. I could pull up one of them. I'm not sure, but even if it does have a switch
Well, let's
ASIC,
talk about what you're using, right? So you probably have standardized on one of the
yes,
CRS models, I'm guessing.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
when
tell
we
us
were
about what you're doing.
Yeah, when we were looking at the wiki, we were looking at what switches And then the two big ones again for us. This is coming from a WISP. If you're in a different industry where maybe PoE isn't critical to you, because there's plenty of industries where PoE isn't, like vital and essential. Like if you're in data center or something like that, like PoE is probably not critical. You just need a big, just a big high port density switch. Well, if you're a WISP, PoE is everything, right? Like PoE is your whole world, with other than the exceptions of having, radios that are coming out now that are fiber plus DC, and then PoE doesn't really matter, but those are typically reserved for, higher end, high transit backhauls. But for 99% of the access points, your WISP, your typical WISP access points that are being deployed, they're PoE. So having capable and high density PoE is just vital, like there really is no substitution for it. So of course we were like, okay, so for the layer 3 hardware offloading, yeah, there are some switches that support layer 3 hardware offloading, but if it's only a 5-port switch and there's no PoE, then I'm like, oh, okay, well, that doesn't really benefit us very much. So the two big ones, again, are the Net Power 16. And when I was looking at the list of supported devices, my heart kind of started. I was getting heart palpitations when I saw the 16P on there, because I was like, oh boy, that's going to have some really serious implications. The fact that that is one of the things that's fully supported for L3HW. And then also looking on there, and I don't know it, it's the CRS 328. It's basically the 24 port rack mount capable, and there's two variants of that. There's the PoE version and then the non-PoE version. Both of them support L3HW, by the way, but for us, we were interested in the PoE
PoE,
version.
yeah.
And I had never actually purchased one of those before. So prior to me even learning and understanding the depth of L3HW, I had never even bought a CRS 328 before, because that was very much, it was just a switch. Like this is a switch only, and it's not even outdoor rated. So, prior up to that point, I was like, well, what am I gonna do with this thing? But once I saw and understood, I was like, I need to order one of these. I need to start playing with these things and really understanding how this works. So at that time, we already had net powers deployed out in the field. Like we already had net powers at several towers. All of them were only running RouterOS version 6 though. Like we didn't have any that were running version 7, and I understood. So I was like, okay, well, let's upgrade these to version 7 so that we can even look and start to play with this L3HW setting at all, and see what it's about. So when you upgrade a switch from V6 to V7, L3HW isn't just turned on by default. So that is something that's important to note. Like if you're expecting that it's just like you upgrade to V7 and oh wow, now you have this magic. No, it doesn't work that way. If you do an in-place upgrade, one, you're hoping that your config doesn't break, which MikroTik has done a pretty good job of. If you're doing an in-place upgrade from V6 to V7, it'll preserve your configuration. And we haven't had any issues. I think MikroTik has been pretty true to that statement, that if you just do like an in-place upgrade, your configuration will stay intact. And they also have a wiki that talks about going from 6 to 7 and changes that you can expect, because there's some syntax that's different. But a lot of it is exactly the same. But yeah, L3HW is something that you have to enable. You have to configure it and make sure that your configuration actually supports that. So there are ways
Yeah.
that
So
you.
what are some of the gotchas that you've run into?
Yeah. So, and fortunately, again, I got to give praise to MikroTik, because on the L3HW wiki, they actually have a whole section on the wiki that is
They do,
common
like do it right, do it
misconfigurations.
wrong.
Yeah, yeah. And it's crazy how many of those I was like, oh, yep, we did that. Oh, yeah, we did that. And it's not that it's wrong, because with version 6, that was either the only way to do it, or
It
that
was
was
valid.
that was a valid
Yep.
way of doing it. But then when you do it, so that's interesting, is you upgrade to version 7, it'll preserve that configuration so everything works, but then you try to enable L3HW and it turns on, but it doesn't work. And I guess, and I can show you how to tell, because that was my, I guess, to enable L3HW is just a checkbox. Like there's just a box that you can go in, or you can do it from command line and you can say, okay, it's now on. But then you're like, okay, is it doing
It's
anything? How do I even
turned
know?
on, but it's not necessarily active. Yeah.
Right. And for that matter, how do you even know? Like how do you, and so those are things that I can show you as well. Is like, one, how do you know that it's even doing anything? Like how do you know that it's active? And how do you figure out what
Yeah.
parts of your
Do you want
config?
to jump into a MikroTik now and
Yeah,
show us some of the things that
yeah,
you
for sure.
discovered?
Okay, so here we are logged into, this is actually not a net power. This is a CRS 328, but it's going to be identical. If you want me to, I can also show you on a net power, but it's going to be identical for both. I think if you look at the wiki, like the switch chips that are in them are nearly the same, and the configuration is literally the same. So,
Yeah,
um,
so walk us through what
so
your experience was of like, hey, I upgraded to 6 to 7,
right,
and then I turned it on, and
right.
show us where you turned it on, and then what you were looking for and how you were able to kind of
Yeah.
figure out
So here we have
what you
this.
need to do
You can
to
see that
get
this is
yourself in
running
shape.
7.16.1, which is a little bit behind, but not too terribly far behind. Um, so
The
on
current, I think,
the
is 717
717,
today.
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I was just agreeing with you. 717 is the current today,
yeah, yeah.
as of recording of the video. Yeah.
So if you've never upgraded to version 7 at all, then some of this on the left may look different to you if you're only accustomed to V6. But what we're looking at here is switch. And I want to say that even within V7, somewhere from certain versions of V7, they even changed the menu on the left even more. But it's still going to be under the switch menu, no matter what. So if we go to switch and then L3H, okay, actually this is not, but that's fine. We can pull this up here. So these are actually just the factory default settings here. So IPv6 hardware is not even enabled by default, and that's fine. We're not doing any V6. I don't know about the ICMP reply on error. And then, okay, so this checkbox, actually it's a disabled because it doesn't support it. So that means that this particular switch does not support fast track hardware offloading, which is more of a router function. And that'll be something that I can show you, but that'll have to be on a different device because doesn't apply on the 328 at all. So really there's nothing to see in that menu. What we want to go to here is we want to go to switch and then settings. Okay. So on switch and settings, we can see that this particular switch only has one ASIC, and it's this Marvel right here. So if I double click on this and look at the switch settings, you can see that there is this checkbox down here for layer 3 hardware offloading. And admittedly, and MikroTik Marc might know more than me about this. I couldn't even tell you what the RSpan stuff is. I can honestly say I've never ever used that, never once in 15 years. Don't know why you'd want to do it. Doesn't really seem relevant to the layer 3 hardware offloading discussion. And then you have the QoS hardware offloading, which I'm assuming is if you're actually having the tick itself do your QoS, but we don't have any of our ticks doing QoS anyway. We use a QoE vendor for that. So we'll effectively ignore that. So when you first upgrade to, well, forget upgrade, anytime you log into a switch, unless you've explicitly configured it otherwise, this L3 hardware offloading is going to be unchecked. So that's what it's going to look like. So to turn it on or to enable the functionality, you literally just put a check mark and then you can either hit apply or okay, and then it's on. And you don't really get any indication per se that it's doing anything. You're just enabling the feature. So we can put this away. And this, by the way, this is an actual production switch that's carrying like a good amount of traffic. So I can pull up interfaces here, and we can look at, here's the one that is coming in from, okay, so here's the main upstream facing interface on this switch. So this is pulling in, I just saw it hit 2.3 gigs, breaking a gig. So it's pretty good amount of traffic for this switch.
It looks like 100,000 packets per second at least on just a
Uh,
single interface.
Yeah, yeah, and there was like 200,000 packets per second. Okay, so the first step is you want to see, once you enable it, especially if you're doing an in-place upgrade, it's totally different, obviously, if you're doing like a brand new deployment of this where you're, swapping out. But if you have like a version 6, either a 328 or like a net power, and you're just literally doing an in-place upgrade, the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to check and see if, what L3HW is even doing, if it's doing anything at all. So when you turn it on, in the checkbox that I showed, the only way that we can check, and I don't think that they've built this into the GUI anywhere. I'm pretty sure they have not, but you can
We'll
go,
double
yeah.
check because I thought that they did actually. I think that they do now have it in the GUI, but let's check.
So
We'll
how
we'll
I know is you have to go, uh, oops, it'd be interface, switch, nope, Ethernet, switch. There you go. It's interface, Ethernet, switch, L3HW settings, monitor. Okay. So what this is going to do is this is going to do a real-time monitor, and it's going to show how many of your routes, and this is your V4 routes, exist in total. So meaning how many routes are even known to the switch that are in the routing table versus how many of them are being hardware offloaded, exist in the hardware, and then how many are in the CPU. So you can see here, we've done we've done a perfect job. We've successfully got every route from hardware, or every route from the CPU into the hardware, with the exception of the one. And MikroTik Marc, do you have any guesses what the one is?
I actually don't.
That would be the Admiral SSTP. So the Admiral
Uh,
SSTP client, because SSTP
I was gonna
tunnels,
say it better not be.
nope. It's so that
So it's
this router,
yeah, it's PPP interfaces.
yep. So
Yeah,
this,
that makes
the,
sense. It's got to be software forwarded
yep. So the SSTP
because
does
it's a
not support,
dynamic interface.
yep. So that literally that you see, that's the only one. That sole route is the only one that's still processed in the CPU, which is no problem. So this is really what you're going for. Like these right here, that's what you want to see. You want to try to get your routes hardware offloaded. Another way that you can view this, although it's not quite exactly the same, because it doesn't give you a breakdown of like your next top cap and how your V4 hosts, is you can go to, well, let's just pull up. I'm going to close this for now. I'm going to pull up IP and then routes. Okay, so here is a V7 routing table, which looks a little bit different than a V6 routing table, but it's still a routing table. So you'll notice that over on the left here, we actually have an additional flag that hasn't existed before. And if I mouse over, we can see that H flag. So that is hardware offloaded. So we can look through and we can actually see that every route that is in the routing table, and I have no filter, right? No, I have no filter on. So we're just looking at the full routing table that's on this switch. We can see that every route is being successfully hardware offloaded or being handled by the switch ASIC. And if I want to, I could apply a filter, and then I could go and I could say hardware offloaded is no. And then, okay, yeah. And it looks like there's actually, well, there's two routes. And again, this is the routing table versus like the L3HW engine, because to me, this looks like two, but the L3HW engine says that there's only one route that's still being processed in the CPU. This one is just our loopback. So on this switch, I have a bridge with no ports in it that I just have a /32 on. That's just a management loopback, and that isn't being hardware offloaded. And then of course we have the remote Winbox VPN. So this would be ideal. This is the most ideal circumstance because every route, the default route is hardware offloaded. Every route known to this switch is being successfully hardware offloaded and being handled by the ASIC. So let me pull up, and I have the CPU. I
What
have
that means really is that you can get multiple gig performance out of this switch at layer 3 versus getting, line rate
yes,
at layer 2 only and
yes,
having
because
to
it's
do
it's
the router on a
effectively
stick performance.
it's layer 3 at line speed. It's layer
Mhm.
3 at switch speed, which is crazy. So I can pull up in the top right there, you'll see I do have my CPU ticker that's displayed, but I'll pull it up on system. What would I do? Resources. That's fine.
And then see,
Okay.
yep,
Yeah, okay. So you can see the CPU load now. I would imagine, honestly, that probably a significant portion of this is just the fact that I am logged into this switch. It's the management. It's that, I'm logged in with Winbox.
it's
Uh,
the fact that
uh,
you're using
right.
Winbox.
It's the
Yeah,
fact that I'm
yep.
using Winbox. But why this is important and what you have got to remember is once you have successfully enabled L3HW, any traffic that is using L3HW isn't touching this CPU anymore. So that the number doesn't necessarily correlate to anything. So even if you were to have,
Performance. That's
right,
right.
it doesn't necessarily correlate to the performance of like down, well, for us, like subscriber traffic, because subscriber traffic is fully hardware offloaded. So what you will find is that as the actual, okay, so we had a little spike there. As the actual subscriber traffic increases on this switch, the CPU load doesn't really increase. Like it kind of just stays the same because it's not touching it anyway. So we saw that the switch was passing about, I'll pull this back up again here. Okay, so we're doing it right there. It hit over 2 gigs. We're looking at, but it's about a gig. That's a pretty good clip of traffic. So I want to show you what will happen if I go to switch settings, and then I'm going to disable layer 3 hardware offloading. So I'm not going to change anything about the config. All I'm going to do is disable layer 3 hardware offloading.
If you're actually going to do this, and you certainly don't have to because you said this is production network, um, I would say also turn on the CPU window on the system resources because
Oh
that'll
yeah.
kind of show you the cores themselves, and you'll get a better
Oh yeah.
indicator.
Good idea. So no, that's fine. I mean, we're only talking, it's a few seconds. I don't think anybody will, nobody's going to notice for a few seconds. So if I go tools, what would I go? Well, there is only one CPU. So would I go all, I guess?
Okay, I wasn't sure if this was a dual core. Some of the switches do have 2 or 4 cores on them. This one only
Right.
has one. Okay.
And yeah, right here, it shows in resources. This is just a single core 800 megahertz ARM CPU. Um,
Like
so
you mentioned, I mean, 800 megahertz is much faster than switches of the past,
yeah,
but it's still not, uh, it's by no means powerful
yeah. So
in
if
today's routing world for sure.
I'll just real quickly do this. And you know what I will actually do, even though I don't believe it's going to be necessary, but just to be a good steward, I'll go ahead and enable safe mode
Safe
in
mode.
uh, in Winbox in case I get kicked out of this, because I'm accessing
That sounds much safer to me.
I am accessing this switch over that backhaul link that is carrying the customer traffic. So if the CPU gets completely crashes out because of that and I get kicked out. So we'll go ahead and call safe mode there. And then I will uncheck that and we'll see almost instantly. Okay, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
I'm
it's
not surprised one bit by that because that's
getting
pushing everything to
hammered, absolutely hammered. And then I'll
absolutely.
turn
I
this back on, and you'll see as soon as the engine even engages,
think it's still catching up and
there we
boom.
go.
Yeah.
I mean, that's wild.
It's
that is
beautiful.
a
It's beautiful.
right. I'll take off safe mode there. So that's the first time that I ever saw this in practice. I mean, it blew my mind. That absolutely blew my mind because I was like, this switch and the CRS 328 is even a little bit more capable than the net power, but it's more expensive. You can check. It's a bigger switch. It has four 10 gig fiber ports instead of two. And then it has 24 PoE ports as opposed to 16. So it is a bigger, beefier switch, and it might have a little bit better of a CPU. But even still, okay, even still, I want to say that I think the CRS 328 is a from our distributor. I think we paid 400 and something bucks for this, and we have a. So you're talking for under $500, you have a 24 port PoE switch that has four 10 gig optics that can route over a gigabit per second and still not even touching the CPU at all. I mean, how do you even overstate that?
That's
Like
incredible.
how do you begin to overstate how mind-blowing that is to be able to do that? So, when there are routers, obviously if you're comparing this to something that is a true dedicated router, maybe the discussion might be a little bit different. But honestly, I kind of feel like, if you compare it to like a CCR or, maybe a 4011 or, a 5009 or something like that, the discussion might be a little bit different. But even in MikroTik's flagship routers, which are the 2216 and the 2116, CCR 2216 and CCR 2116, they are incorporating switch ASICs for the purpose of doing L3HW. So even MikroTik acknowledges that this is such a big deal that they are leveraging it in the highest end products that they have because they understand the ability to do routing in hardware, in the ASIC for the prices that these are is game changing. And so I kind of feel like personally, what we're going to see is I kind of feel like we're going to see a phasing out of their routers that don't have switch ASICs in favor of ones that do, because there are now with the introduction of L3HW, there are switches that can do more routing in the switch ASIC than more expensive routers can do just in CPU. And so it's like
Absolutely.
when things get to
Yeah.
that point, it's like, well, why even continue to buy that router? Which I had said there are features, there are situations that cannot do L3HW because your configuration does not support it. It'll never support it. So there's no replacement for having a really capable CPU for features that really need it. But for us, that's why it almost feels like a gift for WISPs. For us, this is just a switch or this is sitting, like in the middle of our network somewhere. We're not
Yeah.
doing
In this case, you don't want to have a super security policy. You're not
right,
looking to do any kind of traffic
right. If I pull up,
manipulation. You're really just trying to get whatever comes in to go out as fast as
yeah,
possible, which is the perfect case for the layer three hardware.
yeah. So if
So
I
tell
look
me a
at,
little bit about some of the features that you have seen aren't capable of being that'll take it out of L3 hardware and put it into slow path, which means pushing
uh,
to the CPU.
well, I might not be the most qualified because I have kind of ensured that all of my config could support it. But really, the MikroTik wiki they have the exhaustive list of anything that is not supported that would be, far, far better than any explanation that I could give. But I will tell you, and so it's not so much features. So don't necessarily, it's not necessarily features that weren't supported as much as it is configurations that weren't supported. And for us, kind of the big one is so it used to be, and with version 6, okay, let's say with version 6, if you were, doing VLAN trunking, and so you're doing VLAN trunking, typically you would have your trunk port that if you're doing router on a stick, let's say you'd have your trunk port, and then you would be banking all of your VLANs on the trunk port, that you're trunking across to the switch. That was the way to do it. So that is actually, even though your config will work if you upgrade to version 7, because of the dependency on the switch ASIC for L3HW, that's no longer the way that you configure VLANs. So if you want to leverage L3HW, you actually need to move some VLANs around. So the way that VLANs have to be configured now is VLANs have to actually go on a bridge. So you have to create a bridge basically just to like initiate the L3HW engine, and then you assign the VLANs to the bridge. And then you put the actual physical trunk ports into the same bridge as well. And then you do your tagging slightly different like that. So I can pull that up and I can show you what that looks like. So
Yeah, so for folks that have come from maybe a Metro Ethernet kind of scenario, or familiar with some other gear that might be familiar, but I know for MikroTik users that especially have been there since early days, like that was not the way that you did it. It was just
yeah,
like you're talking about, you'd stack them on physical interfaces.
yeah,
So, and then maybe you'd bridge them together later on. And now, absolutely, that building that bridge becomes the first step, not the
yeah.
not the last.
So here I have only one bridge on this switch, and I just called it the L3HW bridge. If we
Yeah,
go
I
to
usually call
ports,
it switch for the so
yeah,
same thing. It's the first thing I build, and you're right. It's arbitrary the name. You're just putting a placeholder here for the
right,
stuff that you're going to attach to it, and this is the way you
right.
got to do it if you want to get L3.
Then moving over to here. So this is another under the ports tab. This is kind of a debated, but like a best practice type thing. So if you have not had stuff in your ports before, or stuff in your bridge ports before, the way that we kind of standardized on doing this is every single time we deploy a net power 16 or a 328, is we just take every single port that's on that switch and we just drop it into the same bridge. And the reason for that is you can, as needed, get in and disable them, as you've seen here. We have all of these that have been disabled because we don't actually want those ports bridged together. Those are separate ports that we're doing routing on. Where they're not actually bridged. But when you add it to the under bridge and then ports, you can disable them, which effectively makes them not a part of it. But why we did that is because, let's say that we move some stuff around, where we're moving cables around, and now we want to use this port that wasn't a part of the bridge. Now, rather than having to like remember to add it to the bridge, you can just re-enable it. Like re-enable it. So that's kind of been our best practice, is we just add everything to the bridge to start, and then just enable the ports that we actually want to be bridged, and then leave disabled the ones that don't need to be bridged. That way they're already in there. So you will see that under so for all of these, the PVID is still the same. Like, nothing really changed. Nothing changed there. That's your ingress. That's just the tag that's being slapped on any traffic that's ingressing from that port. And
And
then
it's
if you,
untagged. Yep.
yeah, anything that's untagged, it's
Untagged.
just,
Yep. Yep.
yep,
Anything. Yep.
yep. And then if we go over to VLANs, and this is so cool. So this
It
is one of the
is.
newer things. This is one of the newer things in version 7, and I couldn't tell you exactly when this happened in version 7, but I definitely know for certain that it was not this way with version 6. So you'll notice that all of our VLAN entries are showing as dynamic. And if I were to pull up a config from like an older switch, uh, none of them were dynamic. You had to manually specify your VLANs, and that's actually a MikroTik has kind of come a long way. MikroTik for a long time, for basically as long as I can remember, has really been lambasted for the way that they do their VLAN configuration, where people have been like, it's not intuitive, it kind of doesn't make sense. Other vendors are doing it much simpler. And I will digress and I'll admit, like even, coming from like Nutanix, which I think the VLAN configuration in Nutanix is actually literally identical to the VLAN configuration in like the Ubiquiti. It had like a legacy product. It was called like a
And
tough
it's
switch
very
or
straightforward, right?
right.
Yep.
It's about as simple as you can get. So we were kind of spoiled coming from, Nutanix where it's dead simple, and then it was way more complicated in, MikroTik. It's more powerful, I guess, but kind of seemingly unnecessary, and I guess
I don't know if
my
powerful. It's definitely more possibilities to configure it.
right.
But
Yeah.
then, like you mentioned, then maybe you configure it, maybe not quote unquote wrong, but in a way that won't support some of the features that you want, like turning on L3HW.
Yep. Yep. That's exactly correct.
Yeah, before jumping on, yeah, let's take a look at the bridge settings a little bit, and then
Yeah.
we can take a look at how you are creating
I
those trunk VLANs.
I
Yeah.
forgot to mention this. This is another gotcha. Something that it's not necessarily obvious is if you go into your bridge, you double click on your bridge to go into the settings here. Um, I have STP disabled because I know that a loop is literally impossible in my configuration, so I do not ever enable it. But I guess there's reasons that people would want to be. I've actually seen it cause more problems than what it fixes, and I know that it's literally impossible for me to get a loop here. So yeah, under VLAN. So literally it is if you come in here, if you've never set it up, this VLAN filtering will not be checked. You check it, and then everything else I have just left at the factory default, actually. The only thing I guess, for this is for people that maybe know even more than I do. I have I guess it might be a better security practice to say admit only VLAN tagged and then specify like a different PVID here. But this PVID is actually only the basically like the management. It's the management VLAN to access the switch itself on on a VLAN. So but this PVID will not actually have any impact on like customer traffic or have any impact on hardware offloading. I think that's literally only just to access the switch. I think that's right. Think that,
Um, it's like you're saying because that port VLAN ID, that's what PVID stands for, right? And so
yeah,
there's no physical port assigned here. So how are you going to get an untagged frame into this switch that we're doing VLAN filtering on that
yeah,
should always have a VLAN tag on it? So
sure.
it's like you're saying, this particular setting is definitely not as important and critical as having, hey, I'm going to get untagged frames from this next hop device somewhere else that's
Yeah,
plugged into a physical port, and I need those untagged frames to go into some VLAN.
yeah. Then flicking over to the VLAN tab here, so you can see that's what's incredible is you notice every entry in my VLAN tab is there dynamically, and not only does it dynamically add it, it even comments why or how it was dynamically added. So you can see on every one of these, they were dynamically added because there is a PVID on the port, which is over here on ports. So all of these are the actual physical ports that are assigned to the bridge. And you can see that so like there's a cluster of 3 that have the same VLAN ID. These have the same, those have the same. And that's because they're sharing the same subnet. So they're on the same VLAN. So just assigning them the same VLAN ID over here automatically adds them to your VLAN table the tab, which for me, I'm like, yes, that makes way more sense. Like that's kind of the way. I'm surprised it hasn't been that way the whole time, because logically, if I'm tagging that port, yes, I want to also create a corresponding VLAN. I don't know why it hasn't been like this forever. But yeah, I'm like, that is exactly correct. And so you can see in here, this VLAN 67, how it's dynamically added, Ether 18, Ether 17, and Ether 19, because all of those are the same subnet and they'll all share the same VLAN. And then this one is, you can see that this guy has VLANs 64 through 68 and then 164 through 165. And that was created because, so this added by VLAN on bridge, that's actually over here. So these ports, or these are the actual software VLANs that I put on the bridge. And that's what we talked about you don't actually put your software VLANs on the trunk port, you put them on the bridge, your L3HW bridge. So just even adding these software VLANs on this screen dynamically creates this entry over here. So for me, this was way more intuitive. It made way more sense than previous iterations, that once I actually did my specific PVIDs, the VLAN table was just created for me.
Populating automatically.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And for anybody who's not tracking on the significance here, I'm guessing that then your VLANs created on the bridge as software L3 VLANs, and
Yep.
this is where, SVI and what is a VLAN, is a layer 2, layer 3 conversation comes into play. The deal there, right, is those must have an IP address assigned to them so that you've got
They
routing
do.
happening across those
Right here.
VLANs. So this is inter-VLAN routing, and
Yep.
exactly like we're seeing there, you've got some IPs assigned to them, and that's the way that you configure them to keep in L3 hardware.
Yep. Yep. That's exactly right. So anyway, I mean, I could go on and on about it forever, but I'm telling you, L3HW, it really changed the game. If you're for a WISP, and for our application with needing higher density PoE switches, but then can now also do a crazy amount of routing, it's totally changing the game for us. It's a wild. I mean, you saw it. You saw how wild of a difference in performance that made with a gig of traffic during non-peak even.
Yeah, so if you've got a CRS device, you should take a look at the L3 hardware, especially if you don't need to turn on any advanced features or stuff that isn't L3 hardware supported, and you can get some smoke and performance out of a very low cost device.
Yeah, absolutely. Very low cost. Couple $100 gets you just crazy performance.
Tyler, any other caveats or items that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, I mean, not really. I think that I'm excited about a lot of this new stuff that MikroTik is coming out with. And also, like in all of our testing, even with upgrading to version 7 and with enabling L3HW, nothing that we've really done has had any impact on our ability for Admiral to manage our stuff. We upgrade it, we turn on stuff, everything just continues working the same as it always has, which was pretty awesome. Very, very glad to see that's really empowered us to get to take stuff we were already using for a while and just upcycle it into something that's going to be really sustainable for years. So it's good times. Good times.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Tyler. Appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
You, audience, for joining us for this video. Hope you enjoyed it and learned something, and we'll see you next time. Keep routing the world with MikroTik, and if you use MikroTik, please take a look at Admiral.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Are you a network engineer or operator with questions, ideas, and stories to share? Want to connect with us on Bridge Mode? Send us an email at bridgemode@admiralplatform.com to get the conversation started.